I have seen this before in history. When a nation begins to fracture, the language of its politics changes. It grows sharper, louder, more theatrical. It stops being about governing and starts being about survival. Tonight, when Sean Hannity warned of dark days ahead, his words echoed a familiar pattern. The invocation of fear as a political weapon is this is not unique to one party or ideology. It is a recurring feature of societies in democratic decline. When fear becomes the language of power, it is no longer simply commentary. It becomes a mechanism that shapes behavior, polarizes citizens, and accelerates institutional decay. The rhetoric is relentless. The other side is cast not as a political opponent, but as a mortal threat. Every policy disagreement becomes proof of national betrayal. Every election becomes a battle for civilization itself. I have seen this dynamic tear apart nations from Chile in the 1970s to Eastern Europe in the years before their democratic collapse. It does not happen overnight. It happens through the steady erosion of trust when political narratives are designed not to persuade but to divide. Hannity's warning is one example in a growing chorus of voices telling Americans that the darkness is not around them, it is each other. This is how democracies weaken, not when enemies invade from abroad, but when citizens turn on each other with conviction that the other is the enemy. The institutions designed to mediate differences, legislatures, courts, elections are overwhelmed by the noise of fear. And fear, once it enters the bloodstream of democracy, spreads faster than any ideology. The tragedy is not that one man says the nation is in peril. The tragedy is that millions are being conditioned to believe it without reflection, without dialogue, without hope. Every democracy depends on an invisible center, a fragile space where citizens may disagree, sometimes bitterly, yet still share enough trust to sustain a common project. When that center collapses, a nation begins to drift. I have watched this pattern emerge before in the twilight of European empires, in the final years of the Soviet Union, in America itself, during other moments of profound crisis. What makes this moment particularly dangerous is that the collapse of trust is not the result of a single event, but of a sustained erosion year after year, scandal after scandal, outrage after outrage, until the center can no longer hold. Today, the language of American politics is defined not by persuasion, but by suspicion. Every policy debate is cast as existential. Every opponent is labeled an extremist, a traître, a threat. When Hannity speaks of dark days ahead, he is drawing from this well of deep polarization. It is no longer about the usual struggles between parties over taxes or trade. It is about whether the country itself can be shared at all. This is what happens when politics ceases to be about compromise and becomes about survival. And in that transformation, something essential to democracy withers. When nations lose their center, they lose their memory of common purpose. institutions no longer act as neutral arbiters. They become battlegrounds. Courts are politicized. Elections are contested not through reason, but through claims of illegitimacy. Legislatures stall because consensus is no longer a goal. At such a moment, even small crises, an election, a shutdown, a local protest can tip the balance. I have seen this fragility before. It is the kind that ends not in reform, but in rupture. The danger now is not simply that Americans are divided. Democracies can survive division. What they cannot survive is a shared conviction that the other side's victory is a national catastrophe. When that belief hardens, the democratic project itself begins to unravel. The center doesn't explode, it quietly disappears. And when a nation becomes unmoored, fear fills the vacuum. Every political fracture requires an engine to sustain it. Fear alone is combustible, but it must be fed to burn. In America today, that machinery has become finely tuned, a fusion of partisan media, political operatives, and cultural amplifiers who have learned to turn division into currency. I have watched this phenomenon in many countries, and the formula is alarmingly familiar. First, fear is named, then it is repeated, then it is monetized. What begins as outrage ends as infrastructure. In this moment, talk shows, social media platform, and partisan networks have mastered the art of turning every political issue into a spectacle of threat. A policy disagreement becomes evidence of national betrayal. A single protest becomes proof of impending collapse. Narratives are no longer built to explain the world, but to inflame it. Hannity's dark days ahead warning is only one voice among many, but its power lies in how seamlessly it fits into this wider ecosystem of alarm. This is not the language of governance, it is the language of mobilization, designed to keep citizens anxious, engaged, and polarized. The machinery works because it thrives on emotion, not evidence. Fear spreads faster than facts. Outrage travels farther than reason. And in this landscape, truth itself begins to blur. Every claim is filtered through loyalty. Every fact is either weaponized or dismissed. Over time, this corrodes the shared reality that democracy requires to function. I have seen nations slide into this trap before. In each case, the result was not simply louder politics, it was the erosion of the very idea of a common world. This is why the machinery of division is so dangerous. It does not need to convince everyone. It only needs to convince enough people that trust is impossible, that dialogue is pointless, that compromise is weakness. Once that belief takes hold, even the most stable institutions begin to buckle. A republic built on the promise of self-governance can collapse, not with a coup, but with a slow, deliberate corrosion of its foundation. Every democracy stands on an invisible foundation, the shared belief that its institutions, however flawed, are legitimate. This is not a matter of paperwork or procedure. It is a matter of faith. Citizens must believe that elections reflect their will, that laws apply equally, and that courts can be trusted to decide fairly. When that faith erodes, the structure above it begins to tremble. I have seen this in societies across the world, and the signs are unmistakable. America is now displaying many of them. When Hannity speaks of dark days ahead, his words resonate because they land on soil already loosened by years of doubt, trust in Congress, in the presidency, in the judiciary, in the media. Each has fallen to historic lows. Neither party has a monopoly on that mistrust. Both are implicated in it. The more polarized the country becomes, the less legitimacy its institutions can command. Every court ruling is seen as partisan. Every election result is contested before it is even counted. Every law is read not as justice, but as the victory of one tribe over another. This is how democracies hollow out from within. Institutions may continue to function, inform courts, hold sessions, ballots are counted, bills are passed, but the belief in their integrity begins to collapse. And when legitimacy is lost, the door opens to something far more dangerous. Citizens begin to look for alternative sources of power, charismatic strongmen, radical movements, conspiracy-fueled networks. The state is no longer trusted, so people seek authority elsewhere. I have watched this moment play out in history. In Weimar Germany, legitimacy dissolved long before power officially changed hands. In the late Soviet Union, citizens no longer believed what the government said, even when it told the truth. And in the modern United States, trust is splintering, not just between parties, but between realities. A republic cannot survive when it is no longer believed in. The warning signs are not distant, they are here. History does not simply repeat, it reverberates. Its echoes grow louder when nations refuse to listen. The fear-driven language now dominating American politics, amplified by warnings of dark days ahead, is not unprecedented. It is the same script that has played out many times before, often in the final stages of democratic decline. I have spent much of my life studying these moments, and the patterns are hauntingly consistent. Societies that lose their shared reality, their trust in institutions, and their moral compass do not slide into darkness by accident. They walk there step by step. In the late 1920s and early 1930s, Weimar Germany was paralyzed by polarization. Each side viewed the other not as a rival, but as an existential threat. Economic uncertainty, cultural tension, and political fear fed a media landscape that magnified outrage. The republic did not fall when the stormtroopers marched. It fell when the people stopped believing in it. In the 1950s, America itself entered its own age of fear when McCarthyism turned neighbor against neighbor. Loyalty was measured not by principle, but by suspicion. The institutions survived, but their moral authority was deeply scarred. These are not distant lessons. They are warnings. Fear is an accelerant. It turns the ordinary mechanisms of politics into something far more dangerous. It justifies extraordinary measures, légitimise demagogue, and corrodes the common ground on which democracy stands when a political culture becomes defined by warnings of collapse. The collapse itself grows more likely. Fear does not merely predict dark days, it helps create them. The most unsettling echo of all is how familiar it sounds. The language of threat, the promises of salvation by force, the framing of politics as a battle for survival. These are not the signs of a healthy republic. They are the drumbeats of a society at risk of consuming itself. America still has the chance to hear these echoes and change course, but history will not wait forever. There comes a moment in every unraveling democracy when fear ceases to be rhetoric and becomes reality. It doesn't arrive in one dramatic stroke. It creeps in through institutions that no longer inspire trust, through words that inflame instead of heal, through divisions that are no longer bridged. When Hannity warns of dark days ahead, what gives those words power is not their volume, but how easily they fit into the national mood. It is a mood of exhaustion, suspicion, and quiet rage, a society beginning to turn against itself. I have watched this horizon emerge before. It is marked by certain unmistakable signs. Political debate becomes warfare. Protests lose their civic character and turn into spectacles of fury. Leaders, rather than calming the storm, ride its winds to consolidate their own influence. Truth fragments into tribes, each with its own version of reality, and slowly a nation begins to prepare itself for something it swore would never happen, a future in which the rules no longer apply. The danger lies not in a single event, but in the normalization of the extraordinary, when what once shocked becomes expected and what was once unthinkable becomes inevitable. The dark horizon is not a prediction of civil war or collapse. It is something subtler and in some ways more dangerous. The death of shared trust, once gone, it cannot be rebuilt easily. A republic can rebuild its roads, its budgets, even its armies, but when trust disintegrates, the very soil of democracy turns barren. Every conflict becomes permanent. Every crisis becomes existential. Every election becomes a battle to the death. And in that environment, darkness doesn't just loom, it settles. This is the horizon America now approaches, not because one party is evil or one man is to blame, but because fear has replaced conscience as the dominant force in the national conversation. The danger is not merely ahead, it is already here, forming slowly like a storm over still water. And if it is not confronted with moral courage, it will not pass. It will deepen in every age of fracture. There comes a moment when a nation must decide whether it will surrender to fear or reclaim its conscience. America has reached that threshold. The warnings of dark days ahead are not destiny, they are symptoms. Fear has settled into the bloodstream of the Republic, but fear is not immutable. History offers us not only cautionary tales, but also examples of resilience. Societies have pulled themselves back from the brink before, not through the power of fear, but through the quiet, disciplined work of moral renewal. The path of reclamation does not begin in Washington. It begins in the moral center of the citizenry. Democracies do not survive on the strength of their institutions alone. They survive because ordinary people refuse to accept that division is inevitable. When polarization is at its peak, the first act of resistance is the refusal to see the other as an enemy. It is not naive to believe this. It is necessary. No constitution, no election, no government can function when trust has been completely burned away. Rebuilding it requires courage, the courage to confront lies without becoming their mirror, to demand accountability without dehumanization, to speak the truth even when the loudest voices profit from fear. This is the moment when leadership is tested, not the kind measured in slogans and ultimatums, but in restraint and moral clarity. In the 1930s, Franklin Roosevelt spoke of a nation gripped by fear and declared that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. That was not a rhetorical flourish. It was a strategic act of national courage. In South Africa, after decades of division, Nelson Mandela refused to build his nation on vengeance, choosing instead the harder path of reconciliation. History does not belong to those who shouted the loudest warnings. It belongs to those who dared to imagine something better. America can still choose this path. It can step back from the abyss, not by silencing fear, but by refusing to let fear rule. That is the essence of moral realism, to face hard truths without surrendering to them. If the Republic is to be reclaimed, it will not be through rage or retreat, but through conscience, a power far quieter and far stronger than fear